Welcome to Specimen the Sociologist. My name is Jessamyn Reichman, and I tend to tell folks that it rhymes with specimen, but with a J. My love for people has now grown to a podcast, and this platform leverages sociological theories and storytelling to equip listeners with a fresh perspective on their lived experiences, as well as to provide them with a few social skills. Now, before we dive into our business spotlight, I want to give a quick shout out to my three amazing siblings, Jama, Jolie, and Rory. Thank you guys for teaching me how to love others and to be loved in return. Now, to kick off today's episode, I'll be starting with the business spotlight. This is an opportunity to showcase a local business that has developed their skill and is ready to share it with the world. Now, today's spotlight is one of my favorite restaurants in one of my favorite cities, and that would be Cane and Table, located in New Orleans, Louisiana. The beautiful thing about Canes and Table is when you enter their space, you are immediately immersed into a whole new world. The building was built in the early 1800s and it carries this timeless charm, yet with a nice level of minimalism. So you'll have the original raw plaster and brick exposed with aged mirrors and glass chandeliers, and of course, the courtyard full of various New Orleans tropical flora. And as I said before, you truly step off the main street and you go into a world unlike anything you've ever known. Now, the best part, of course, is the food. The executive chef, Alfredo, also known by his friends and colleagues as Fredo, is a New Orleans native of Cuban descent. His culinary style is shaped by his innate appreciation for Cajun cuisines, coupled with his Cuban heritage and upbringing, with his first culinary memories stemming from his mother and grandmother's abundant home cooking. And with that being said, this isn't just a restaurant, it's a home. And as the menu changes seasonally, you have to make sure to keep your eye out for an item that grabs your attention. Whether it's a coastally inspired dish or Cuban infused cocktail, Cane and Table is an unforgettable experience. Or at least I can't forget about their seafood paella and their house daiquiri. But without further ado, let's dive into today's episode called Sister Sister. This podcast will discuss the social concept of kinship and the role that our siblings play in our becoming. Because, let's be honest, sibling relationships can be a mystery at times. Perhaps in one season you're extremely close to them and you love and adore them, and perhaps in another season you may feel like you know nothing about them, or everything they do may just piss you off. But nonetheless, siblings play a critical role in how we are taught to engage those around us, and inevitably, how we view ourselves. So, if they play such an important role in our life, I think it's time that we reflect on their influence and what it has been for us up until this point. So, turn the volume up and let's dive into the world of siblingship. If you know me, you know that I love a good American sitcom. And today's title was actually inspired by none other than the 90s sitcom called Sister Sister. It chronicles the lives of two Black twin sisters, Tia and Tamara, who are adopted separately at birth but spontaneously reconnect 14 years later when they run into each other at a mall. Now, the cool thing about these actresses is that they are real twins in real life. But anywho, back to the storyline. So Tia and her lovely mother, Lisa, move in with Tamara and her prudent father, named Ray, and it just creates the best foundation for a sitcom. Because in each and every episode, you can expect a little bit of everything, whether it's a dramatic family fight or an emotionally charged makeup scene. You can just throw in a little sprinkle of boy drama in there as well, and you'll get a few life lessons out of it too. And that's what I love about the show is that it walks you through the daily affairs of a family, but it always leaves you in a joyful mood. And so whenever I'm done watching an episode, it reminds me of my older sister, Jama, which unfortunately, we are not identical twins, but we are Irish twins, which for those of you who don't know that term, it means that we are siblings that were born within a year of each other. and technically for us, like 9 days. But who's counting? Anywho, Jama and I have been attached at the hip since we were young, whether it was sharing the same room up until the age of 10, to attending the same elementary, middle, high school, and even college together. Wherever I go in the world, she always is a step or a FaceTime away, and that is a privilege that I no longer take for granted. Now, similar to T and Tamara, we've experienced the throes of life together, and our relationship has been probably the greatest mirror in my personal life, a reflection of growing pains and maturity, as well as a reflection of my core values and who it is that I'm becoming. And as the sitcom Sister Sister walked us through the joys of siblingship, I too wanted to take you on a walk, but with a splash of social science. So hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll be able to take a few lessons away from my sibling and I's relationship. Now, today's episode is going to look a wee bit different. Instead of leveraging a sociological theory, we're going to unpack the concept of kinship in sociology and discuss our sibling relationships from this perspective. Kinship, in simple terms, is understood as a social construct that describes the relationship between individuals based on blood, marriage, or adoption. Now, recently, a few sociologists and anthropologists have argued that kinship can actually go beyond familial ties and involve social bonds. From there, you'll get certain terms such as the chosen family or perhaps your work husband. So, whether you're actually family or not, kinship can be understood as a system of social organization based on real or putative family ties. Now, there are three primary types of kinship that we're going to discuss today. And the first is consanguineal. Now, I don't know if I pronounced that word properly, but hopefully I did, which, on a completely different note, I am the queen of not only making up words, but also misusing them. So much to the point where I have a running list on my phone of all the times and words that I just make up or mix up. And I'm trying to think. Sometimes I'll get rosary and rosemary mixed up. Other times, oh my God, there's actually two specific stories that always make me giggle. One was when I was a senior in high school, and this was like college application season, and I was asking my best friend, Sanchez, I said, "Hey girl, like, did you get into the school in New York? Did you get into Sierra Leone?" And she's like, "No, Jessamyn, I did not get into the country in Africa, but I did get into Sarah Lawrence. If that's what you're referencing." And I'm like, "Oh my God, tee, that makes sense." Or another good one, this one probably was one of the most embarrassing ones. I went to a tulip festival with my mom and her dear friend, which here in Washington State, we have the annual tulip festival, which takes place, I believe, in Mount Vernon, which is like an hour and a half north of Seattle. Anywho, the festival consists of about 7 to 8 different tulip farms, and it's just so wonderful to go through all the rows and to chat with people and to take pictures and then to grab a yummy bite of food afterwards. And anywho, one day we were walking through the tulip fields, and my mom and her friend ran into one of their mutual friends. And somehow I began to tell a story, but I got monogram and mammogram mixed up. And so I kept on saying mammogram. And so it wasn't until halfway through the conversation where everyone just started cracking up. I'm like, "Why is everybody laughing?" They're like, "Girl, because you were misusing the wrong word." And I'm like, that makes sense. So, anyways, back to the first type of kinship, consanguineal. Hopefully, I'm saying that right. This is the primary form of kinship, and this is based on blood or birth. This can include relationships between parents and children or siblings to siblings. Now, the second type of kinship is affinal. This kinship is based on marriage. So typically, this would be a relationship between a husband and a wife, or a husband and a husband, a wife and a wife. Basically, is two worlds legally coming together as one. Now, the third one is the best one. It's the social one. And by definition, this type of kinship entails two or more people who are not connected by birth or marriage. Rather, they live in different communities, yet share a unique bond through either a religious affiliation or a social group. So this can be seen as, Christianity, or perhaps your fraternity brothers, or perhaps you guys belong to a fashion house. It can be any and everything. Now, the primary difference again between a social kinship and that of the first two other ones is that these relationships can be terminated indefinitely. So oftentimes there's no legal or social consequences. That person is just simply out of your life. Out of all of these types of kinship, we're going to focus on the first, and that being consanguineal. Now, it sets us up perfectly to discuss sibling relationships and dynamics, and specifically the role that our siblings play in our personal development. Now, you may be wondering, Jessamyn, why are you spending so much time talking about kinship? And what role do our siblings even play when it comes to our personal development? And that, darling, is where we're going to dive into this conversation a little bit more. So, the reason why kinship is so important is because it literally serves as the foundation of our lives, right? The way that we engage, interact, the way that we view people, the way that we even view ourselves. And so, a few things that kinship offers is one, it sets up a guideline for how we communicate and interact with other people. Number two, it helps us to better understand our relationship with ourselves and with others. And number three, it helps maintain unity, harmony, and cooperation with others. Now, these all may sound quite similar, but what they offer is like the social standard for how we navigate life. Now, we're going to pause and give a quick little shout out to all of the only children here. I know while you're listening to this podcast, you may be thinking, hey, Jessamyn, I actually don't have a sibling, and it is okay. I want you to still take this information and store it in your heart, because perhaps it will give you understanding towards a friend who does have a sibling, or perhaps it might give you insight into how your parents relate to their siblings, aka your aunts and your uncles. Now, circling back to kinship. Kinship essentially is the social fabric that ties family and even societies together. And anthropologist George Peter Murdoch best said it. He said, kinship is a structured system of relationships in which kins are bound to one another by complex interlocking ties. Now, if this is true, then it's these systems that regulate how life flows. And that's why it's important to talk about. But anywho, instead of just talking about kinships in general, we're going to talk about our sibling relationships. And this is where we are going to actually get a little bit more casual in the conversation. So, as I mentioned earlier, I have three awesome siblings. One is 27, the other one is 16, and the youngest one is 13. So, for the longest time, I honestly thought I was going to be like the last child, the baby child. And then my parents were like, "Tee-hee-hee, we got two more on the way." I'm just like, you guys. Now I'm the awkward middle child. But anyways, I digress. So this next part of the episode, I'm going to talk about each of my siblings. I'm going to talk about their amazing attributes and the lessons that I've learned from just being able to do life with them. So the first one goes to the one and only oldest child, Jama. Now, my sister, as I had mentioned earlier, we are Irish twins. We are technically a year and like 9 days apart, but no one's really counting. And despite our closeness in age, we could not be more different. She is quite adventurous. She is bold. She rarely takes no as an answer. And despite her personality, she probably is one of the most sensitive people I've ever met. She has the biggest heart. She is always willing to give her time or listening ear or her opinion. And she truly adds just the spice of life that's needed for all the siblings and I. And one thing that I've learned from our relationship is despite having a shared upbringing, I still have to recommit myself to learning more about her. And it's so fascinating because as a sibling, while you may grow up in the same household, you may have different experiences. And just because you may be exposed to someone, you may see them, it doesn't really mean that you know who they are or really who they're becoming. And so over the past few years, I have really had to put away my narrative of who I thought Jama was, and I get to ask her who she is. And with every conversation, and whether that's an easy one or a tough one, I just get to know more about her. And in turn, I get to know more about myself, which leads me to the first lesson that I've learned from her, which is instead of stating a standard, you get to reinforce it in your behavior. For example, earlier in the summer, she and I had a emotional heart to heart, and I remember just kind of coming to her and saying that, like, hey, kind of dissatisfied with where our relationship currently is. I feel that I'm pouring a lot into you in these various ways. I don't feel as if there's like the same level of reciprocity or acknowledgement. And I just want to let you know where I am, and I want to know like how you feel like you're showing up in the relationship, and like, like where are we? Because in sibling relationships, you can get so accustomed to just like going through the motions of life, like the holidays and the birthdays, and let's grab a meal, and you just kind of get used to routine without actually getting to be in a relationship with them. And so I found that I was like, okay, I'm in a routine, but am I in a relationship with you? And if so, then I want more. I want more for us. After that conversation, I really walked away with like, okay, Jessamyn, you can't just say you want something and not become that thing. And so after that, I just made sure that I was initiating more of like intimate conversations with her, or asking her how her day was, or really just spending as much time together as possible before she moved off to New York. And so again, it just was a healthy way for me to like kind of come to my senses and be like, you know what, Jess, if you want to change something, you have to be that thing and not enforce a crazy expectation onto them. But it really does allow a new way of communication to be formed, which leads to the second lesson that I learned from my older sister, which is to embrace the process of learning, unlearning, and learning again. You are ever going to evolve as individuals, and it's always important to kind of circle back to the core values that keep you together, not just the shared experiences that you have. And with my sister, Jama, I realized that, perhaps the way that we communicated when we were younger, maybe we can mature and communicate in a healthier way. Or perhaps I can communicate in a healthier way, right? What I love about sibling relationships is like they're not really going anywhere. So you might as well just show up as the best version of yourself. And that leads me to the third lesson that I learned from her, and that is to overcome the judgment part. While you get the front row seat to your sibling's life, that doesn't mean that you have the authority to render unsolicited advice. So even with our proximity, I still have to allow curiosity to be the thing that leads me in conversations. So I'm not leading with assumptions, not leading with how I think she may be feeling, or how I think she may be processing, or how I think she may be having fun and rejoicing and kicking it. But rather it's like, no, like, girl, tell me where you're at. Like, who are you? Like, it's always just kind of fun to like imagine Jama as a lovely little onion, and I'm just pulling a layer back with every conversation or with every interaction. Now, that is sibling number one. And the second sibling is none other than Jolie. And this little girl is a freaking firecracker, let me tell you. She is so creative. She is always learning a different language, whether it's Mandarin one second, Korean the next, or Japanese the third. She is our little built-in chef in the family, and she's probably the most sincere and passionate out of all of us. Like, she is just like I don't even know if she's an anomaly at times. But we have a 10-year age gap, and it was so fascinating growing up because I was her camp counselor for probably like 3 summers. And so I always had just like this older sibling perspective when engaging with her, where I don't ever step into the role of parents. Like, she has my mom and dad. Like, she's good. But like as an older sibling, I get a little bit territorial. And I'm like, okay, girl, like no one's gonna mess with you. I got you. Like, I'll cover you. What do you need? Or there'll be moments where I'll even try to deposit like little nuggets of knowledge or little bits of wisdom because I want her to become her own phenomenal person. But I realized there was a moment where she switched from being my former kid at camp to being a teenager and now developing into her own personality and just really becoming like, a young lady. Well, the biggest lesson that I've learned from our relationship is one, allowing your younger sister to form her own identity outside of the one that you kind of helped curated when she was younger. And that even with being your quote unquote brother's keeper, you still have to provide space for them to have autonomy. Now, if you don't know what brother's keeper, what that is, it's an idiom that means people have the responsibility to help and protect others. One thing I realized with JoJo is okay, as you are growing up and becoming your own person with your own personality and you're building friendships and you're just really just growing up, it's like, okay, like how can I at least protect the parts that are pure, like your personality and your core values, and like how can I just make sure that that always is how we connect. And so yeah, that's one thing I learned from that little girl. Another thing I've learned from her is redefining what support looks like for her. So again, with a 10-year age gap, I can kind of come into a conversation with like my quote unquote wisdom and be like, you gotta do this, you should do this, you should do that. But I realized that I'm like actually loving Julie in the way that she wants to be loved. And sometimes that can be a challenge for me, I'm not gonna lie. But again, just being alongside her in the learning process is what it means to be a sibling and to really just be grace filled in those interactions. And yeah, so I would say the last little lesson that I learned from her is from our relationship is to learn to apologize and assume responsibility. That no matter if there is a 10-year gap, if there's a 2-year age gap, if there's a 3-year age gap, is that she is her own person. And she, even at her young age, deserves honor and respect. And if I fail on my part to honor a commitment, or perhaps I'm a little bit snappy or a little bit spicy, I gotta apologize. And I can't just push it off. Because again, another mindset that I have is this is a relationship that I'm going to carry into a lifetime with me. Like this little girl is going to be alongside me for my life's greatest accomplishments. And I'm going to be next to her for hers. And one day, God willing, if we have family and we get married and, travel the world, it's just going to be the foundation for how we communicate moving forward starts now. It's really fun to just, I don't know, create a new standard for how we want to talk to one another. And let me see. I think that's all I got for her. I also will say another thing about that little girl is she is a snuggle bug. Oh my gosh. If you love to snuggle, she is the one. She's so, 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 so sweet. Now, the last but not least little sibling, his name is Rory. And while he is the youngest, he is also the tallest. So the dude is 6'2" and he's only 13. And what's so funny is my parents, they're both kind of like short. Um, so it's funny just like how this kid just shot up like a little beanstalk. But anyways, his nickname is Moose because despite being 6'1", he was actually born prematurely and he came out weighing like 5 pounds, 6 ounces. Like dude was like a tiny little nugget. And so my family and I we were a little like scared at first. We're like, oh my gosh, like dude's like a preemie, like he's tiny, tiny. Like I can remember even going to the grocery store and buying preemie diapers and they were just tiny as hell. But when we got into the NICU, the nurses were chilling, not even sweating at all. They're like, this kid is so big. We have kids in here who are less than a pound. This kid's 5 pounds, 6 ounces. He's a moose. And so his nickname Moose just kind of stuck with us throughout the years. If you hear me go from Rory to Moose, that's kind of the backstory of that nickname. But anyways, one thing about this kid is he is probably the most steady out of all of the girls. He has a way of just being really clear in his communication. He also is very detail oriented, and he also has the kindest heart out of all of us. Well, I'll always say I have the kindest heart, but he gives me a run for my money because he is just a really sincere kid. Now, I will say one of the lessons that I've learned from him, despite us having a 13-year age gap, is the power of honoring my commitments. That he really does hold on to words that I say in the commitments, whether they are a yes or whether they're a no. He made me re-examine how I communicate and yeah, honoring those commitments and not overpromising. Which is kind of crazy, but whether it's a small things like he wants to do our weekly game night, or he wants to binge watch Squid Games or Avatar, The Last Airbender together, or he wants to go out for our weekly fun dates, or whether it's our promise to go ride Lime scooters around the city. Like, he also loves quality time. With that being said, another lesson that I learned from him is to forgive fast. That this little buddy, he's very logical. And so that gives him the upper hand of being able to process things just faster, if that makes sense. So if there's ever a hiccup, we'll talk it through and then he'll just be like, okay, and on to the next. It just teaches me, I'm like, okay, like I can process information and I can forgive and we can move past this. Now, it doesn't mean you ignore the offense or you don't allow time to heal from whatever occurred. But what it does do is it puts you on a healthy track to actually processing your emotions and getting back to a stable place. And so I find conversations with him to be pretty easygoing and pretty straightforward. And the last lesson I learned from him would be creating new memories and traditions. Like, this kid is always down for trying something, and he's probably like my little risk buddy. Like, if you want to do something, he's going to do it with you. And he'll give you a little funky face at first, but he'll be like all in. And it's really fun just to, yeah, have him be the cherry on top of all my other relationships. So that is a little peekaboo view into my crazy family dynamic. And hopefully you got to learn a little bit more about my siblings and I. But to bring this back to sociology, this is where we're going to wrap up today's episode, Sister Sister. We discussed the social concept of kinship and how it can be understood as a social construct that describes the relationships between individuals based on blood, marriage, or adoption. Now, we chose to throw in another type of kinship, and that being social. Now, this type of relationship entails a unique bond that isn't familial and can be terminal. So once our relationship ends, baby, it ends. But from there, we discussed the power of kinship and how it helps us to maintain a sense of unity, harmony, and cooperation in relationships. Whether that's by the way of it providing us the tools to communicate more effectively or to establish healthy guidelines for being in a relationship with one another, or even how the various kinships in our life may serve as a mirror to our own social behavior. These relationships basically provide us the opportunity to raise the social standard in all of our interactions. And out of all the ships in the world, whether it's a cruise ship, a situationship, or a kinship, I would argue that one of the most formative ships you could have would be your siblingship. Because these relationships at times are an anomaly. They're often our longest lasting relationship over a lifetime. And while you may think you know a person, you'll never not get to know them. And so what I love is that when it comes to sibling dynamics, it's just kind of cool. Like, you have a built-in buddy for the rest of your life. And as I mentioned earlier, all the lessons that I learned from my tasteful three, I failed to mention one final thing. And that would be how much of an honor it is to be their sister, because not only do I get to know them over a lifetime, but I get to love everything about them, both the healthy and the unhealthy parts. It's just like, you're my little human, and we're going to rock this thing out till the cows come home. And that's just really cool. It's a really cool thing to nurture and a really cool thing to water. And yeah. So, anyways, before I start getting super sentimental and crying, because I love my siblings, even though my house is only like 10 blocks away from my parents' house. But, anyways, I don't care if it's a stone throw away or not. Distance is distance. But for relational resources that I'm going to leave you with today, the first one is, of course, Sister Sister. If you have not watched it, baby, what are you doing? It's streaming for free on Pluto TV, and it is an absolute must. Now, the second relational resource is actually a song that my older sister wrote and produced, and it's called Average. And her stage name is J Money. And yes, the money is a dollar sign. Now, when she's not a full time family therapist in New York City, she is producing beats or writing rap lyrics. Now, I will say, before you look the song up on Spotify or on Apple Music, it is quite explicit, and I would not listen to it unless you're over the age of 18. So, while this is a shout out to my sister, I'm not trying to corrupt the youth of today. So, just keep your ears pure, keep it cute, keep it classy, and a little bit sassy. But that is about it. So thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Make sure to follow the show on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, as well as to leave a cheeky review in the comment section. And in this episode bio, you'll find our business spotlight and ways to sew into the podcast. And I also want to give a shout out to all my friends and family members who have been listening up until this point. I listened to your feedback. You guys want more lengthy episodes. That the 20-minute power pods are cute, but you want to maybe have me go a little bit longer to 30 and 40 minutes. So hopefully that was a job well done today. But until next time, have a powerful day.